We have a second question here from Anonymous, a Chronicles Tifosi patron member, though. Presumably not the hackers group Anonymous. I think that's just...
that's exactly what I said, but yes.
Too much headlines recently. Mina, our Patreon member who sent this message anonymously says, it seems like metrics available in football are more detailed than in the past, and I wanted to get your take on how it has impacted the way you perceive the game. As analysts and journalists, how has it changed the way you report on the games? Does it make your job harder or easier? Do you have a favourite go-to stat? And do you think that the average footballing fan is better informed as a result of having this information?
I don't know what the right way is to answer this this question. So I'm going to answer it from a very personal point of view. I was obviously a football fan, and football for me was a hobby. I didn't want to work in football or be a journalist. That wasn't my aim. I actually looked at and was interested in different industries and actually worked in different industries. But because this is my greatest passion, and I thought that in order for you to succeed, you should work what makes you happy, football became something for me. And when I started writing about it, I obviously had watched football not as an objective person, but as somebody who always went into the game having a sort of a sneaky desire for a particular team to win, or watching it as a fan. So I focused more on players I really liked, or just, generally just how somebody controlled the ball. Like Redondo is probably the first player I really admired from the bottom of my heart as just a player, not necessarily the one who made my heart sing, but I watched him as that. So the whole match could happen and there'd be some amazing comebacks or whatever it was. He was, there was that fantastic match between him and Manchester United when Sir Alex Ferguson was like, you couldn't take the ball away from him. But I was watching it only as a fan. So I didn't know anything that was involved, or what needed to happen on a defensive level, or what was the difference between being on the ball and off the ball, and, just general tactical balance. So when I started obviously having to watch it from that, because I realized that this is what I wanted to do, and I wanted to go and be a journalist and get all the qualifications to be one, and start watching football with an objective eye, I started to learn a lot, and I heavily leaned on metrics to understand that. So that meant I looked a lot on possession, on who was dominating the ball, who were creating chances. But what I felt was that I was a little bit disappointed, because for me, the midfield seemed to always run the show, and there were never enough information on midfielders that showed you how much they ran the show. And that was only actually observed in metrics in 2014 in the World Cup, because it was a World Cup that was won, at least even and admitted to have been won largely due to the presence of Toni Kroos and Sami Khedira, because of what they did in that midfield. And yet none of the stats could really show you just what an impact they had on Germany. I mean, the headlines were all Kroos and Khedira, this wonderful couple in midfield that absolutely dominated and rocked Brazil and rocked, the World Cup, and just dominated in every stat they're supposed to. But you didn't have any stats that proved that. And that's when I started realizing that I couldn't heavily lean on them, because actually what I saw on the pitch and what I could pick up now as somebody who understood football on a different level and watched it from a much more objective point of view, and just looking at movements of the entire team and that how that affected, the opponent, it is really about what happens in your midfield. And I just couldn't find the stats to do that for me. Even if you look at XG, for example, Inter was supposed to score 4 goals against Genoa, and they didn't. So stats are so important, especially if you are somebody who's into betting or anything like that. But I never could, for me, lean on them afterwards when I started to hone in on my other skills in watching football.
Yeah, there's a cartoon I remember seeing, and I can't remember if it was, in my head, is it XKCD or is it someone else? It's a cartoon I remember seeing a while ago that tickled me, where it was just two guys in a booth, and one of them was like, hey, I just got a collection of random numbers. Let's build a narrative around them. And it just says all sports reporting underneath it. And it made me laugh, because of course, that's how it sometimes feels here's some numbers, build something around it. And, I think that sort of just poking fun. That for me, there are some great analytics writers out there who are focused first and foremost on analytics, who have really sort of taken the sort of the time and frankly, the career development and sort of specific training to read those stats and understand them in a really detailed way and pull out the sort of trends that I think require burying your head in those numbers for quite a long time to see clearly. Because I think that it's really easy to look at advanced stats and to highlight something and go, oh, that's interesting, but without seeing the full context. I think that's why you have to be someone who really spends a lot of time with those numbers to be able to always see the important stuff and not just the fluff. There's lots of people doing that. The one in my head at the moment is Grace Robertson on Twitter. She does a great job with it, but not so much focused on Italian football. But there are lots of people out there doing that, and they are analytics people who get it really well.
Even for scouting, like Venezia, they look a lot in the stats, and that's how they choose on which players to buy.
Oh,
and a lot of those is worked out for them.
Football club scouting departments is hugely skewed towards that sort of data now, and I think rightly so. Obviously, we live in the sort of post. It's all Billy Bean and Moneyball, isn't it? Everything's sort of flown from there, and football has followed, and I think it's sort of easy to do both things with that. It's easy to go too far into that, and it's also easy to get a sort of dismissive attitude of like, oh, it doesn't matter. And it's like particularly easy to do the latter one. I mean, do you remember? I was actually just trying to find it now when you were talking. I can't find it. Do you remember there was like last season, Serie A put out this extraordinary tweet with some advanced stats on Lukaku that made no sense whatsoever. It was like all these sorts of names of like types of thing down the pitch, which I couldn't read. Like I was like, I don't know what that means. And I think fans sometimes read that stuff and really roll their eyes and go, oh, come on, what is that? Like it's not real. And I, honestly, in my reporting, to answer the question, I tend to come from the side that I've always come from, which is that I probably in order, like a storyteller, and then someone who's watched a lot of football and who covers a lot of football, has been analysing football as a sport since 2006 professionally. And then after that, someone who's come to understand advanced metrics more as time's gone on. And I think that probably my way of approaching my work still starts from, I watch a game of football, I notice things while I'm watching that game of football, and I start with that as the basis for all of my analysis. And then once I've got some things I'm interested in, I might go say, hey, my eyes told me this. Let's go see what the numbers say and whether they support what I felt watching that game, and whether they don't support it. And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes I maybe miss the statistics that matter, because it's not my full-time job to be ahead in the numbers. But I do try to look for the numbers that seem most relevant. I think I'm always finding new ones. I don't know if I've got one statistic that jumps out at me, because I think it's always different things that relate to different situations and different teams and different players. I mean, in the end, the one that's most ubiquitous, I think I've sort of accepted most sort of completely, is just boring obvious one, which is expected goals. Like I do probably look at the expected goals after every game now, just to see how that skews together with other stuff that I have in my head from that game, and go, oh, does that reflect what I experienced?
Really?
Yeah, I'm always curious. I'm always curious.
Interestingly, yeah, I agree with that. Like sometimes you build a narrative, and so, for example, when we were tasked with covering into Liverpool for various broadcasters or writing about it, I needed to explain that Inter do create so many options, but not necessarily take their chances very well. And so that would be a stat that I'd look at: how many shots, how many of them are on target. And obviously then I'll use the stat if it sort of backs up my argument. And then I'll look at the stat, and if it heavily doesn't back up what I think, then, then I know I'm wrong. And that's just my own feeling about it, but it's wrong. But the thing is with football, what I find so interesting is, I was trying to explain to somebody about Vlahovic and why he's so special, and how can you explain sometimes with stats this is where you need both. You need somebody because I work with somebody who is heavy on stats, and he is remarkable. He doesn't get anything wrong. Like every week, he'll almost tell me the results perfectly because of what the numbers have told him to based on XG or all of these things. And I'm honestly amazed because this guy doesn't know Serie. He's just going simply because he reads stats and he just tells me. And he's almost always right. And he says things and I'm just like, what are you talking about? Like, of course that's not going to happen, Like, he called out Cagliari against Napoli, and he told me that he thinks Cagliari will win against Serie, and I just don't know how he manages these things, So obviously there is an art to it that I might not be understanding, but there's a part of me where it's like, how do I describe to someone that like Vlahovic's first touch is so magnificent that, he can make a Morata bad assist into a glorious assist to score another goal for Juventus. It's that I don't know how to really explain through stats, I guess. I mean, who the great players are. And sometimes, someone will do a lot for the match. Like Rooney is somebody who used to do everything, but actually that might disturb the work of others. Like Matuidi could do that. And it becomes a one-man job where it's too many cooks in the same area. So it's like, you need to get out of my place because this is the block that I'm controlling. So yes, I don't know. But I think there's a desire and a need for both, I guess, for stats and for storytelling.
Like in the end, like the things I don't want to like ever be a dinosaur who's like trapped in some old-fashioned way of doing things that's not acknowledging and respecting all the new information we have that we didn't used to have. I think it's really important. But I think that I also personally think that it's important that we don't get so lost in numbers that we lose what, in the end, the reason people love football, which is passion, which is emotion, which is human life. That in the end, sport is about humans and extraordinary humans who we find compelling to share time with and watch. And that's why I think my experience of football will never be the one that's just the numbers. And that's not to say it's not hugely important, because it is, but it's never going to be how I experience football.